My name is Clara Bennett, and the night I returned home with a Yale law degree and a baby on the way, my parents turned my homecoming dinner into a public execution of love. They didn't ask who the father was, they just threw me out like I was a stain on their reputation. But the truth they never cared to ask would soon shatter their perfect little world. Because the man they called my mistake was my father's billionaire boss's son. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location below and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories. I remember that night as if it's carved into my bones. The suffocating stillness in my parents' dining room, the smell of pot roast clinging to the air, the tick of the old wall clock that used to comfort me as a child now thundering in my ears. I stood there with my Yale law degree in one hand and my free hand resting protectively over the small swell of my belly that no longer hid beneath my blazer. My father's face shifted from confusion to fury as though he'd just discovered a crime scene in his own home. "You're a disgrace," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "Not welcome here. Not part of this family anymore." My mother's voice came next, calm and sharp like a polished blade. "You made your choices, Clara. You chose failure. So don't expect us to save you from it. You can sleep on the streets." And just like that, my homecoming dinner became my exile ceremony. What cut deepest wasn't their cruelty, it was their indifference. They hadn't even asked who the father was. Because if they had, their reactions might have shattered into something very different. But when you care more about what the neighbors might whisper than your own daughter's well-being, you don't stop to ask for details. If you've ever been cast out by the people who were supposed to love you the most, then you'll understand what I felt standing there. Drop your location in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because what happened next will make you believe in karma. But first, let me take you back to where it all began. I met Ethan Caldwell during my freshman year at Yale. Out of thousands of students from across the country, what were the odds that another kid from my tiny Indiana hometown would end up in the same pre-law program? Ethan was the son of Richard Caldwell, the CEO of the very company my father worked for. Back home, the Caldwells were a name you didn't say lightly. Wealthy, respected, untouchable. But Ethan wasn't like his father. He had the same striking eyes and confidence, yes, but underneath all that privilege was someone gentle, curious, and just as homesick as I was. We bonded over late-night study sessions, shared frustrations about East Coast winters, and inside jokes about the cornfields we'd both grown up around. For 6 years, 3 of undergrad and 3 of law school, we kept our relationship a secret. Not because we were ashamed, but because I knew exactly how my father would react. He'd either accuse me of gold digging or worse, try to use it for his own career gain. I could hear his voice in my head. "So, Clara, maybe you can put in a good word for me with your boyfriend's father. Think that promotion might finally come through?" The thought made my skin crawl. So we stayed quiet. When we went home for the holidays, we pretended to be nothing more than acquaintances. At Yale, everyone knew we were inseparable. At home, we were just 2 kids from the same town. The secrecy wore on us, but we promised ourselves it would all be worth it once we graduated, once we could stand on our own accomplishments. Then 2 pink lines changed everything. It was January of my final semester. I stared down at the pregnancy test, hands trembling, the room spinning as I tried to imagine how my life had just turned inside out. Law school was already brutal, but now I had to juggle classes, internships, exams, and morning sickness that hit like a freight train. I'd excuse myself from lectures, splash cold water on my face, and return smiling, pretending everything was fine. Ethan was over the moon when I told him. His reaction, pure joy, was the only thing keeping me grounded. When we told his parents, they reacted with the kind of kindness I hadn't known existed. His mother, Grace, started knitting baby clothes before I'd even processed the reality. His father, Richard, opened a college fund before we'd even agreed on names. They were thrilled, not ashamed. Richard had clasped Ethan's shoulder and said, "Finally, a grandchild to spoil." By the time graduation rolled around, I was 5 months pregnant and running out of creative ways to hide it. The graduation gown did most of the work, but I knew I couldn't keep it secret much longer. Ethan wanted to come with me when I told my parents, but I convinced him to let me go alone. "Let me handle it," I'd said. "I'll tell them first. Once they calm down, you can fly in tomorrow, and we'll do this right." I was so naive to think there would even be a tomorrow in that house. The 12-hour drive back to Indiana felt endless. I spent it rehearsing speeches, imagining every possible reaction, even making a PowerPoint. Yes, an actual PowerPoint, showcasing my law degree, the job offer at a top Chicago firm, Ethan's proposal, and our plans. I even added a slide titled Proof of Stability, because if law school taught me anything, it's that evidence matters. But what I didn't understand then was that some juries never listen to evidence. They come in with their verdict already written. When I pulled into the driveway at 6:30 that evening, it was exactly as I remembered. The same beige siding, the same cracked porch light, the same stupid garden gnome Mom insisted was quirky. I sat in the car for a moment, taking a breath, hoping the walls would somehow feel different now that I was grown. They didn't. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her smile tight and forced. "Clara," she said, scanning me from head to toe, "you've gained weight." Her voice trailed off like it hurt to say something remotely polite. "Nice to see you too, Mom," I said. Inside, the dining room smelled like pot roast and disappointment. Dad sat at the head of the table, halfway through a beer, already irritated. "Thought you'd be too fancy for family dinner now that you're a big lawyer," he muttered without looking up. I swallowed my irritation. "Actually, I have some news. Sit down," Mom interrupted. "Food's getting cold." So I sat. For 20 minutes, I listened to them complain about the neighbors, the mayor, the church committee, everything except my life. Not one question about Yale, graduation, or what came next. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My chair scraped the floor as I stood. "I need to tell you something." That's when Dad finally looked up. His eyes went straight to my stomach. His face shifted from confusion to dawning horror to rage in the span of 3 seconds. "You're pregnant," he said, not as a question but an accusation. I nodded, heart pounding. "Yes, I am." His fist slammed the table. "You're a disgrace, not welcome here, not part of this family anymore." Dishes rattled. Mom's eyes burned with disgust. "You chose this," she said coldly. "You can live with it." I stared at them, trying to find even a flicker of compassion, but there was nothing. "That's it?" I said, my voice trembling. "Your daughter comes home with a Yale law degree and a baby on the way, and you throw her out without a single question?" Dad's lip curled. "Pregnant and unwed. Probably don't even know who the father is. What will people say?" There it was, their real concern. Not love, not shame, just gossip. "I'm engaged," I said through gritted teeth. "We're getting married in August. I have a job lined up in Chicago." "Lies to make yourself feel better," Mom snapped. "No decent man would have you now. Get out before someone sees you here." I looked between them, the people who'd raised me, and realized they saw me as a stain they needed to scrub away. "Fine," I said, grabbing my suitcase. "But remember this moment, because I will." As I stepped outside into the cool night, the door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed in my chest. I didn't cry right away. The anger came first, raw and blinding. I sat in my car, staring at the house that had once been my home, wondering how love could vanish so fast. And underneath that anger was a hurt so deep I could barely breathe. I was 24, pregnant, and suddenly homeless. I sat there in my car, the engine off, staring at the familiar windows glowing behind those beige walls that had once sheltered every version of me, child, student, dreamer. Now they were just glass and shadows, keeping my parents comfortable in their self-righteousness. I tried to breathe, but every inhale felt like broken glass scraping through my chest. The rain started to fall, soft at first, then heavier, until it blurred the windshield and turned the driveway into a mirror of my own confusion. I had nowhere to go. Every friend I could think of was out of state, and I wasn't about to show up at someone's door crying, pregnant, and disowned. I checked my wallet. $386, my last summer internship stipend. I'd been saving it for bar exam prep, so much for that. The only 2 motels in town came to mind immediately, one by the highway, with neon lights that never worked, and another downtown that looked haunted in daylight. My options were limited, but I wasn't ready to face either yet. I pulled into a McDonald's parking lot just off Main Street, the only place open past midnight, and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring, his voice soft and full of warmth I didn't deserve at that moment. "Clara, how did it go?" I laughed bitterly. "Let's just say I won't be invited for Christmas." "What happened?" His tone changed instantly, protective, alarmed. They kicked me out, I said simply. Didn't ask a single question. Didn't even let me explain. He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "Where are you now?" "McDonald's parking lot. Trying to decide whether the highway motel still has hourly rates or if they've upgraded to nightly." There was no laughter from his end, only controlled breathing. "You're not staying in a motel, Clara. Dad's house has 12 bedrooms. You're coming here tonight." "Ethan, I can't just show up at your father's mansion. You're carrying his grandchild. You are family. More family than those people who just threw you out. Still, it's humiliating. What will he think? Me showing up like He'll think my parents raised me right. I'm calling him now." "Ethan, wait." But he'd already hung up. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. The caller ID said Richard Caldwell. My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected to hear from him personally. "Mr. Caldwell?" I said, trying to sound composed. "Clara," he said gently, his tone more fatherly than my own father's had been in years. "Ethan told me what happened. Where are you right now?" I don't want to trouble you, sir." "Where are you?" he repeated, not unkindly, but firmly. I hesitated, then said, "McDonald's on Main." "I'm sending a driver. Stay inside the car. He'll be there in 20 minutes. I wanted to argue, to insist I could handle myself, but there was something final in his voice that made me nod, even though he couldn't see me. 20 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled up beside my old Honda, its headlights washing the wet asphalt in white. A gray-haired driver in a pressed suit stepped out and opened the passenger door. "Miss Bennett?" he asked politely. "Mr. Caldwell sent me." His voice was calm, like nothing about this situation was strange. He took my suitcase and held an umbrella as I followed him into the car. The ride through the rain was quiet, surreal. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, and my mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. I'd driven past the Caldwell estate many times as a teenager, those massive iron gates, the tree-lined driveway that looked like something out of a movie. I never imagined I'd be entering those gates as a homeless pregnant woman with nowhere else to go. When the car stopped, the mansion loomed ahead, its tall windows glowing like a promise. The fountain in the circular drive shimmered with reflected light, and I caught sight of my own reflection in the glass. Wet hair, tired eyes, fear barely disguised by exhaustion. The driver, his name tag said James, opened my door and retrieved my bag. Before I could thank him, the front door opened. Richard Caldwell himself stood there, tall, composed, dressed in a gray sweater that somehow made him look both powerful and approachable. "Clara," he said, stepping forward. "Come in, sweetheart." The word hit me like a wave. My own father hadn't called me that since I was 6. I stepped inside, my shoes squeaking on the polished floor. The foyer was grand, but not cold. Family photos lined the staircase. The faint scent of cinnamon hung in the air. "You look exhausted," Richard said, motioning for me to follow him to a sitting room. "Have you eaten?" "I'm fine," I lied. He smiled faintly. That wasn't a question. He called out, "Maria." A woman appeared almost instantly, a warm, middle-aged housekeeper with kind eyes. "Yes, sir? Please prepare something for Miss Bennett and have the blue suite readied." I started to protest. "Mr. Caldwell, I can't possibly—" He raised a hand. "Clara, you're not imposing. You're family. Michael's told us so much about you over the years." I blinked in surprise. He has?" Richard chuckled. "Clara, I've known about your relationship since your sophomore year. Did you really think Ethan could keep a secret like that from me? He's brilliant, but subtle. Not so much." My mouth fell open. "You knew? And you never said anything?" "You both clearly had your reasons for privacy. I respected that. I assumed it had something to do with your father's position at the company." I looked down. It did. He would have either accused me of using Ethan for his job or tried to use it for his own gain. I didn't want to put Ethan in that position. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "That sounds like your father. Tell me exactly what happened tonight." And I did. The whole story spilled out of me. 6 years of secrecy, the pregnancy, the confrontation, the rejection. By the time I finished, my face was streaked with tears, my hands shaking. "They didn't even ask who the father was," I whispered. "They just assumed the worst." Richard leaned forward. They didn't think about you at all. They thought about themselves, about appearances, about gossip. People like that confuse reputation with virtue. Maria returned then, carrying a tray of food that smelled better than anything I'd eaten in months. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until the first bite brought tears to my eyes again. Richard stepped out to make a few phone calls, his voice muffled from the hallway, words like whatever she needs and the blue suite drifting through the doorway. When he came back, he sat across from me, his expression thoughtful. Ethan tells me you have a job offer in Chicago. Yes, at Kirkland Ellis. I start after the bar exam. He smiled approvingly. Excellent firm. You'll do well there. Now, I know your father works for my company, but I want you to know this. Your relationship with my son has no bearing on his employment. His job is safe as long as he does it well. I'll make sure there's no conflict of interest. You don't have to do that, I said softly. I do, he replied simply. You've spent years worrying that this relationship would hurt your family. You don't need to carry that anymore, at least not from my end. I met his gaze, the tears threatening again. Why are you being so kind to me? Because you're carrying my grandchild, because you've worked for everything you've achieved, and because you're the woman my son loves. That's reason enough. His words felt like a hand reaching into the darkness I'd been drowning in. I woke up the next morning to sunlight spilling across a room that felt too perfect to be real. The bed was soft as clouds, the air faintly smelled of lavender, and a tray of breakfast sat waiting on the nightstand, eggs, fruit, and tea. For a moment, I just stared at the high ceilings, the pale blue curtains, the antique furniture, the blue suite, they'd called it. It was bigger than my entire childhood home, and yet, for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I was safe. My phone buzzed beside me, 5 missed calls from unknown numbers and one from my sister Rachel. I sighed, silenced it, and turned my face back toward the sunlight. But a soft knock interrupted the peace. Come in, I called. The door opened, and Grace Caldwell, Ethan's mother, stepped inside, graceful and composed in a white cardigan, despite what must have been an exhausting red-eye flight. Clara, dear, she said, her tone warm but steady, I'm so sorry we're meeting like this. Before I could respond, she crossed the room and hugged me, careful not to press against my belly. The gesture was so natural, so full of tenderness, that I nearly broke down again. You must be exhausted, she said, pulling back, and hungry. I told Richard not to let you go to sleep without dinner, but he insisted you were half asleep already. I smiled weakly. He was right. I was out before my head hit the pillow. Well, you look better this morning, she said. How are you feeling? Any morning sickness? Sometimes, I admitted. But it's better now. I think the baby's starting to settle. She squeezed my hand gently. Good. You know, when I was pregnant with Ethan, I lived on ginger tea and crackers. He used to kick every time I ate strawberries. I laughed softly. Sounds familiar. Then her eyes softened in that way only a mother's can. Ethan told us what happened with your parents, she said carefully. I can't imagine how painful that must have been. But please know, you're not alone anymore, Clara. You have us. Before I could respond, another knock came, this time faster, familiar. The door opened and there he was, Ethan, with the same tired eyes I'd seen on FaceTime calls during late-night study sessions, only now filled with relief. Grace smiled knowingly. I'll give you two some privacy, she said, kissing my forehead before slipping out. The second the door closed, Ethan crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled me into his arms. I sank into him, breathing in the scent of his shirt, soap, jet fuel, and home. I'm so sorry I wasn't there, he whispered against my hair. It wouldn't have changed anything, I said quietly. If anything, it might have made it worse. He pulled back just enough to look at me. Dad said you were worried about your father's job, about him trying to use us. I was, I admitted. Still am. You know what he's like. If he finds out who you are, he'll look for leverage. Ethan nodded grimly. Dad's ready for it. Don't worry about that. We spent the rest of the morning talking about the baby, the wedding we'd been too scared to announce, the plans we'd shelved because of fear. We decided to move the wedding up to July, a small ceremony before I started work in Chicago. Unless you want to wait, Ethan said carefully. We could have the big wedding we talked about. I shook my head. No more waiting. I just want to be your wife. He smiled. That slow, familiar smile that always calmed my nerves. Then that's what we'll do. That afternoon, Grace insisted on taking me shopping. Not for baby clothes, but for maternity outfits that actually fit. Comfortable shoes, vitamins, practical things I'd been too proud to buy yet. She talked easily as we moved through boutiques, filling the silence with stories about her own pregnancies, her early years balancing family and work. I'd forgotten how it felt to be spoken to like a person and not a problem. You kept the relationship quiet all these years because of your father's position, she said thoughtfully over lunch. That shows good judgment. Or paranoia, I said, half smiling. Protective instinct, she corrected. You were protecting Ethan, protecting yourself. That's wisdom, Clara, not fear. I felt tears prick my eyes. My parents didn't see it that way. Then that's their blindness, not yours, she said softly. Their loss is our gain. Later that evening, when we returned to the estate, I found my phone vibrating again. The same unknown numbers. This time I answered. Clara, what is happening? Rachel's voice was panicked. Mom's having a meltdown. She says you're at the Caldwell's mansion. Is that true? It is. Why? How? Because I'm engaged to Ethan Caldwell, I said simply. We've been together for 6 years. I'm staying with his family because mine threw me out. There was silence on the line so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she whispered, Oh my God, Mom and Dad don't know. They didn't ask. They're going to lose their minds. She wasn't exaggerating. Within 2 days, my parents' humiliation had turned into obsession. They called me nonstop. When I blocked them, they called Richard's office. When that didn't work, they drove to the estate gates and demanded to see me. Security turned them away. They even got our pastor to call, begging for family reconciliation. Finally, Richard had enough. Let's end this, he said over breakfast, his voice calm but final. Invite them for dinner here tonight. Richard, no, I protested. You need closure, Clara, he said gently. And frankly, I'd like to look your father in the eye when he explains abandoning his pregnant daughter. Ethan squeezed my hand. Your choice, he said, but Dad's right. This isn't good for you or the baby. So I unblocked my parents long enough to send one text. Dinner at the Caldwell estate, 7 p.m. Security will have your names. They arrived at 6:30, because of course they did. Punctuality was their religion. I watched from upstairs as their beige sedan crawled up the driveway, utterly out of place among the manicured gardens and marble fountain. My father wore his best suit, the one from Rachel's wedding, and my mother clutched her handbag like armor. We let them wait 20 minutes before coming down. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Absolutely. When I entered the dining room, I made sure my dress accentuated the baby bump they'd once called shameful. Mom, Dad, I nodded politely, sitting between Ethan and Grace. My mother's eyes darted to my engagement ring, the Caldwell heirloom, a diamond so clear it could cut through her pride. She looked from it to my father, her face pale. Clara, my father started, fumbling. You look, well, pregnant. The word you're looking for is pregnant, yes, I said coolly. My mother forced a smile. We came to apologize. Did you? I asked quietly. Before or after you found out who the baby's father is? The silence stretched long enough to make the silverware tremble. Richard stepped in smoothly. Perhaps we should start with dinner. These conversations are easier on full stomachs. As the courses arrived, the tension deepened. My father cleared his throat. Ethan, I had no idea you and Clara were involved. 6 years, Ethan said evenly, though Clara felt it best to keep things private. She didn't want anyone thinking her father's job had anything to do with us. My mother brightened. That was very considerate of her. I turned to her sharply. Unlike parents who throw their daughter out without a single question. You have to understand, my father said, leaning forward. We were shocked. No warning, no explanation. I tried to tell you, I said. You just didn't want to hear it. We thought you'd made a terrible mistake. The only mistake, Richard interrupted, his tone like ice, was your reaction. Any parent with half a conscience would have asked questions, not thrown their pregnant daughter into the street. My father's face reddened. I don't need a lecture on parenting from my boss. You don't need a lecture, Richard said quietly. You need a soul. No one spoke after that. The rest of dinner passed in brittle silence. When the plates were cleared, my mother finally whispered, "We just want to move past this. We're family." "Are we?" I asked softly. "Was I family when you told me to sleep on the streets? When you sent my things back with a note saying, 'Don't bother coming home'?" Her eyes filled with